Hi everybody, it's me again, Alaina, and I'm here with our other host, Joe. Seen him a couple times before, and as Darius very eloquently put, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of zines, but I figured since I'm in charge of education here, why don't I teach something too? So I'm also going to show you how to make one, sort of similar to these zines that may be in frame, may not be in frame. I have no way of knowing. So Joe's here to come along on this demonstration with me, and we're going to sort of chat through some of the different eras that zines have worked through here. So we're going to start out, big piece of paper like this. I don't know what size this is, but you can do it with an 8.5 by 11 too. So
I think it's legal size.
Legal size.
8.5 by 14.
Write it down.
Maybe?
I've never made a zine before. I can't wait to
But you're
learn.
really knowledgeable about paper, and that's one thing I know about you. So we're going to start, fold it hot dog style. We all remember that, right?
Oh, it's been
It's been a while, probably.
It's been 20 years since I was in kindergarten, if you can believe it. 20 already.
And then hamburger style, never without its cousin. There, okay. And then once we've done that, we're gonna revert back to that hot dog style, all right? So you should have a fold right down the middle. Now we're going to take 1/2 of this section from that fold and fold that in half, okay? So just like so, like that. We're gonna take the time, line it up, make it all nice. And then you're gonna go ahead and flip it and repeat that step, folding inward in half towards that fold. Got it? You're doing great. Okay. Next thing you're gonna need is an X-Acto knife, if you're crafty, or scissors, which you could be crafty too if you have scissors. I just happened to bring this today. So what we're gonna do, now your paper should look like this. We got 8 little portions, check my math, and we're going to cut the top of these squares here.
Okay,
You
the
see, right there.
center
Just those two, right at the
Okay.
very tippy top. Okay?
Okay.
So I'm just gonna, and you know, if you like, I'll just pass this over to you.
I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait to use yours. I don't think scissors are gonna cut it.
I did experiment with the scissors backstage, and it's really not desirable. So then you're just gonna be looking at that little mouth there. Okay. And then once Joe's ready, we'll move on to the next step. If you're following along at home, then I'm really impressed because you didn't have a lot of time to get your gear together. So good on you.
I
Okay.
got A- on that.
I think it looks good.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're gonna take our paper, we're gonna sort of hold it on these portions we've just sliced, and we're gonna kind of pull it apart and pinch it together, like so, until we create sort of a little cross, sort of an X, like that. I don't know if you can see on the camera up there. Okay,
I got lost.
Nope, you're on the right track. There
Like-
you go. That's
like
where you
this.
want to be. Yes.
Okay.
And then left hand that you're pinching here, that's going to fold clockwise and become the back of the zine.
Okay.
Okay, and we're going to try and keep everything sort of nice and neat here. And once that comes through, you're going to just crease it like that. Then you'll
Mine's
have your
kind
little
of-
booklet.
Punk rock.
Definitely. We're going to talk about that later. Yes.
Hey!
Well done. And then if you open it up, you can see these examples up here, or maybe you can't, but sort of open it, and then you got a little book. How cute.
That's terrific. Out of a single piece of paper, no glue or staples or nothing.
You don't even need to do math. So, now that we have our zine, I figured let's sort of decorate it and give you some examples of what a zine can look like. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of zines. But before that, you might wonder, why are we talking about zines? Today's all about public access. And really, what I have sort of discovered is that zines have actually a lot in common with public access TV. So zines are historically, if you don't know, sort of DIY, independently produced publications, sort of designed to be very sort of personal, usually cover a specific topic or highlight a specific subculture. And the idea of this sort of being that as a creator, you want to be in control or have say in not only the content of a message that you want to share, but the means through which it's distributed, right? That actually really matters. So zines and public access sort of share that characteristic, I think. But as far as the aesthetics go and the form goes, I'm gonna take y'all all the way back to the very beginning of the 20th century, and that is with this movement called Dada, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you learned about in school back in the day. Doesn't mean father. I mean, maybe to some people, but
I think it was the original Skibbity toilet.
basically, yeah. You really would associate this with like very surreal art. And you can see in this image behind me here just some examples of that. So this was both an artistic and a philosophical movement. The idea being that we're going to sort of create something that's strange, that sort of challenges social norms, and specifically a lot of this was in criticism of bourgeois culture, meaning individuals who are from, at the time, what we would consider the middle class, so not necessarily the rulers per se, but people who had means, people who were wealthy, especially compared to the proletariat, which would be the working labor class. And what we really see as like the first blueprint, I guess, for zines here is not only that these sort of like wacky characters are getting together and sharing ideas and creating these weird little publications, but we see kind of the first indication of collage, really. They're sort of using found objects, creating juxtaposition between different pieces of imagery in order to create something that has never been seen before. And it was really important to this movement, especially the philosophical side, that the process was going to be much more valuable than the actual product, right? So it was a lot about learning to think differently in order to create, and not necessarily because the final product had a lot of inherent value. It was more about what you learned through doing it, which is also a lot like public access, I think.
Totally.
So then, that sort of brings us to, I don't know, maybe a question of taste here. So personally, or maybe you even think so, you might look at something like this and be like, that looks dumb. That looks nonsensical. You know, it's like an art movement, but this is one of those movements I just don't get, which I understand, and I maybe low-key agree with, but that was sort of the point. They were sort of, these Dadaists or surrealists were sort of pointing at the absurd details of everyday life that we all just sort of inherently accept. So they thought, you know, if we can, especially in the light of World War I and the world sort of witnessing all of these sort of horrors, essentially, they were like, how absurd that we're sort of accepting all of this. Let's sort of create art that reflects the absurdity of life, basically. So that's our first era. Now, what?
I didn't know that.
Oh. I'm so glad you're here, Joe. And then we're gonna move into our next segment here, which is, I think, a much more coherent use of the form, which is gonna come to light during the Harlem Renaissance. So that's about 1917 into the 1920s. So this is where we see a lot of Black artists and writers and thinkers looking to sort of create their own spaces so that their narratives can be told in their terms, right? They're not like trying to get published in some sort of white-centric avenue, which basically everything is at this point. So these zines, and let me move on so you can see some pictures here. These zines are, I would say, the most polished of the bunch that we're gonna see. These are very highly curated because they really took this seriously. This was an important means to disseminate information and share their culture. So
It's like independent publishing.
exactly,
basically.
yeah. This is much more equitable to like highly stylized magazines that we would see today, if magazines still exist. I don't know if they do. So we have an example here from The Messenger. This was founded by Chandler Owen and Philip Randolph. These are both leaders both in the Socialist Party but also the labor movement. And this particular issue is really interesting because it has a lot of direct calls to action. So it's specifically talking about schools are opening on this day. Make sure that your kids get there so they can get their education and sort of have this new sort of lease on life. And also direct appeals to Black men to vote for the 19th Amendment to ensure that women had the right to vote. So that's sort of how they're using these publications. But we're also, while a lot of these are sort of published by, I would say, people who have the means to sort of patronize them, to sort of put money towards them, you see important figures like W.E.B. Du Bois sort of intentionally curating some of these publications to pair really established writers and thinkers alongside up-and-coming ones. The idea being that it sort of like increases their visibility, it increases the exposure that these younger, newer artists get for their art. And then some of those artists, for instance, were featured and helped found this magazine on the other side called Fire. This is an absolutely stacked lineup, by the way, of founders. It's a list of like 10 different individuals, including Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Gwendolyn Bennett, all very famous poets of their time, and even today, of course. Ooh. And within this publication, it's really remarkable. It's the only edition they ever made of it because their headquarters burned down, basically immediately after they put this edition out.
It's called Fire.
I know. It's a little bit freaky to think about. And in this edition, it's very literary focused. So they published poems and plays, experimental prose, essays on, Black lifestyle, sort of interactions they were having with white people to sort of shine a light on the inequity in regular social life, as well as literary criticism, which was really interesting to see as well. So that's our era. That's our highlight on the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to move on to our next one, and this is sort of a weird one. This is where we get into science fiction fanzines. So when you start out researching this, like I did, this is where a lot of people's timeline begins when they talk about the history of zines. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's the first time we ever actually use that word. Though I think the two movements we talked about before this were really crucial to sort of establishing both the aesthetics and the tone and the purpose of what a zine can be and do. So this is really curious. I had to do quite a bit of digging into this because I just didn't understand. So they keep referring to this idea of scientific fandom. And I was like, wow, I didn't know they had that terminology back then. And also, who are we talking about here? Who are they fans of?
We could always use some scientific fandom.
Yeah, there's
I
not
believe
enough.
that.
Please, we need more. And so this is essentially people who read, science fiction magazines at the time and are sending in letters, sending in, stuff that gets them excited and interested. And that sort of becomes or gives way to fan-published works. That's where we see what's considered one of the first zines ever, which is called The Comet, later known as Question Mark and Cosmology. And this is essentially, the first edition was really focused on actually publishing scientific articles. So they were talking a little bit about basically what we would think of as essentially like neuroscience today. They have some articles on that by an actual scientist and someone who studied this. But they also listed, and you can probably not read it super well in that image, but they said, we're trying to spread information about science. We're trying to get the world curious and interested in these ideas that are being discussed and sort of discovered. But we would also love if y'all would go out and establish local chapters of this group. If you would sort of create a community around this and come up with submissions that we can include, which again sort of ties into that public access idea of not only creating community, but also calling for the community to contribute to a publication, to a broadcast like this.
And local communities.
Exactly.
People getting together, people with
Hyper-local
ideas to
efforts.
share ideas.
Exactly, yes. So then that's going to take us into the Beat generation. You probably learned a little bit about this in school. We're into the 1950s now. And this is where we start seeing this group publishes a lot of chapbooks. If you've ever read Howl by Allen Ginsberg, it came out of this era. And they refer to themselves as the Mimeo Revolution, which is funny because the mimeograph, which is how they printed this, existed basically since the 19th century. So they really like to think that they reinvented the wheel, but ultimately this is just a cheap method to reproduce these sort of publications. They like to think of themselves as this very countercultural group. They're not about conformity. They're not about convention. They're about sort of freedom of expression. I can't end here, guys. And then through that, you see them sort of covering what we would call maybe a little bit more of rebellious topics that would normally be highlighted at the time. So you get this sort of high-low pendulum of a really crass topic being discussed in a very poetic way. A couple of prominent figures that came out of this era were Ed Sanders. He was a huge publisher of zines, and he published artists like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, etc. All those names that you probably already know. We're going to keep cruising along here. That brings us to the 1980s. We have the queer movement. And let me move on here as well. And this is where zines especially become really essential modes of documenting personal history. Queer people were aware at the time that their erasure in the public sphere in everyday life was also going to reflect throughout history, that their stories and their experiences were going to be lost if they didn't take the responsibility to document them. So that's where this sort of first arises from. But this is also the height of the AIDS crisis and epidemic. So it also becomes a great way to validate each other and share support, as well as share guidance and safety tips in order to prevent transmission. They're also very critical of capitalism and police brutality, which they're obviously facing quite a bit at this time in particular. And through all of this, they really strike this tone of wanting to completely remake and rebuild society in a new light, but also remaining very optimistic about what the future can include. And then that brings me to my last era that I'm going to talk about today. It's off? Okay.
Are we clear?
Can someone say?
Are we still live?